Evening, friends. I'm Beau LeClair, and this here's the Dixie Tales, where the Deep South still whispers if you listen close. These are the stories that never made the history books, but live on in the heat, the dust, and the hush between crickets. So pull up a chair, tap that like, and subscribe if you believe some truths are too wild to stay buried. Most folks who ain't from New Orleans tend to picture this city the same way postcards do. Trumpet on a balcony, gas lamps burning soft, river fog rolling in like a lazy ghost, and the scent of beignets drifting through the French Quarter. But anybody born within shouting distance of the Mississippi knows the Quarter's got two faces. One for daylight, where the paint looks pretty and the music feels friendly, and another for the hour when the lamps burn low and the streets carry footsteps that don't always belong to the living. Now, I've told y'all plenty of stories about curses, queens, spirits, and the sort of old country faith that made its home here, before the city even had a proper street map. But tonight, what I'm about to tell you ain't legend. It ain't folklore. It ain't something whispered by your grandma to keep you out of trouble. This one's carved straight from police files, morgue reports, and yellowed newspapers that trembled when the truth touched them. This one's real. So real the city tried to forget it ever happened. Tonight we're talking about the Voodoo Murders, and if you think that sounds like some Hollywood ghost story, God bless you. Because the real version is the kind that sits behind your ribs long after the video ends. The kind that makes you keep a light on. The kind that stains a whole city with questions nobody's ever been able to bleach out. Let me ease you into it gentle-like, because the Quarter back in the 1920s was a different beast than today. Louder, rougher, more alive, more rotten. You had jazz seeping from every door, sailors stumbling through the alleys with pockets full of cash and nowhere safe to spend it, bootleggers moving barrels through the night, and brothels stacked one on top of another like sinful little hotels. But beneath that noise, beneath the drinking and dancing and sinning, something else simmered, a quiet war between faiths, a collision between the old spirits and the New World's law books. And when that war finally spilled out into the open, it did so in blood. The police never knew what hit 'em. It all began, officially at least, on an early morning in the summer of 1922. A Tuesday, humid, the sky the color of dying bruises. A milkman walking down Ursuline Street noticed something on the steps of an abandoned Creole townhouse. Something curled, hunched, wrong-looking. He thought it was just a drunk sleeping it off. Maybe a sailor. Maybe some poor fool who'd lost his money at the craps tables. But when he got closer, his stomach dropped like a stone in deep water. The body was posed, arms folded across the chest in a way no dead man ever falls. Eyes wide open, mouth full of ashes, the skin carved, not slashed, not hacked, carved with precise, looping lines that curved across the chest and down the ribs like some strange alphabet. A symbol was painted on the wall behind him in dried, dark streaks of blood. A crude, but unmistakable veve, the kind used to call spirits. And sewn into the flesh just below the sternum, literally stitched into his skin, was a small cloth bag. A gris-gris. Police had seen gris-gris before. New Orleans was no stranger to hoodoo or voodoo charms. Folks used them to bless babies, to protect their homes, to pray for good luck. But gris-gris sewn into a corpse, that was something else. Something darker, something nobody wanted to name out loud. The detectives on scene logged the symbols, photographed the body, and took statements from the neighbors, who, like most people in this city, when spirits are involved, didn't see a damn thing and didn't care to. But what happened next is what turned a strange murder into something much bigger. Because the next morning, another body turned up. This one lay in a courtyard off St. Philip. A young woman, dressed in white, eyes painted black, mouth sewn shut. A matching carved symbol on her right shoulder, identical to the one on the man's chest, and a gris-gris bag sewn into her thigh. Now let me pause here so you understand the weight of this moment. 2 ritual killings inside 24 hours in a neighborhood where spirits are treated more seriously than taxes. 2 bodies marked the same way, carved veves, painted symbols, gris-gris threaded into skin like some hideous signature. To the police, this was a pattern. To the people of the quarter, this was a warning. And to the old women who kept candles burning in their kitchens and whispered prayers over pots of red beans. It was a war. The papers called it the work of a madman. Locals called it something far older. They called it a spiritual feud. The kind that goes back to the earliest days of Congo Square, back when enslaved men and women gathered on Sundays to drum, sing, and whisper the names of spirits carried over the ocean, back when the church tried to hush them and failed, back when the city learned for the first time that faith don't die just because someone else don't like the language it speaks. See, the 1920s weren't kind to the old ways. New Orleans was trying to look respectable. Prohibition raids, moral police, Catholic pressure on the quarter, all of it grinding down on the practitioners who'd kept their faith alive for generations. And in that pressure, old grudges woke up. Rival priestesses, competing temples, secret societies that traced their roots back to West Africa. People who believed the spirits needed to be defended, even violently. So when that first pair of ritual bodies showed up, the elders of the quarter whispered one name. Somebody's calling the spirits for war. By the end of that same week, the city learned how right they were. Because body number 3 didn't show up in the quarter. It showed up at the edge of Congo Square. Let me tell you, I grew up hearing Congo Square stories. My grandfather swore the ground there remembers everything that ever happened on it. Dancing, drumming, shackles, freedom, pain, power. The earth is heavy with memory in that place. And when something unnatural happens there, the whole city feels it. The victim was a dock worker, big man, strong, tough enough to brawl with sailors and come out smiling. But the detectives who found him said his face looked like he'd died, terrified. His chest was bare, carved deeper than the others, the veve more elaborate, lines intersecting, curling, spiraling like a map of some spirit world only the dead could navigate. The gris-gris sewn into him wasn't a small charm this time. It was a full pouch stuffed with bones, herbs, hair, and coins. When police removed it, the body shifted. Not twitched, not jerked, shifted, like something inside had been waiting to breathe. The coroner refused to log that detail officially. The city wasn't ready for anything that didn't fit in a neat little box. But the detective on scene, a man named Leon Boot, wrote it in his private notes, and those notes still survive. I've seen them. The ink trembles where his hand must have shaken. Now up to this point, police were still trying to treat the murders like ordinary crimes. But ordinary murders don't involve veves carved with ritual precision. Ordinary killers don't bring bodies to Congo Square. And ordinary gris-gris don't get sewn into dead flesh by hand. Detective Boot, born in Tremé, raised around the old beliefs whether he practiced them or not, was the first to admit the truth. This ain't a crime spree, this is a calling. And like any calling, the city had no choice but to listen. Fear spread through the French Quarter like fog before the river wind. Shopkeepers lit candles in their windows. Musicians refused to walk home alone. Mothers kept their children off the streets after sundown. Some said the killings were revenge, the spirits angry about the city's crackdown on voodoo gatherings. Others whispered the murders were the work of a hidden society trying to summon a low eye that hadn't been called in generations. A few old-timers claimed it was even simpler. Somebody broke a rule, and the spirits came to claim what was owed. But no matter which theory you believed, the truth felt the same. Something ancient had woken up in New Orleans, and it wasn't slipping quietly back into the dark. The murders kept coming. Not every day, that would almost be merciful, but in steady, sickening waves. Always the same signs, carved symbols, blood-painted markings, and a gris-gris sewn somewhere into the body, like a signature left behind for the dead to recognize. And here's the part that chills me most, every time I tell it. The symbols evolved. Each new body bore a more elaborate veve than the last. Lines sharper, curves deeper, shapes overlapping into patterns even experienced root workers refused to interpret. Some symbols spiraled, others forked like rivers. A few resembled crucifixes, twisted into new forms, like the killer was blending faiths on purpose, forcing heaven and hell to share the same space on human skin. One priest claimed the symbols looked like inverted blessings, the kind meant to reverse protection rather than create it. A midwife swore she'd seen one of the shapes before, drawn in ashes over a dying woman said to be cursed. The police, they were drowning. Corruption was already thick in New Orleans back then, half the force too drunk to think straight, the other half paid off by brothel owners, bootleggers, and gamblers. Ritual murders were the last thing they wanted on their plate. They tried to blame a cult, a madman, some runaway butcher from the slaughterhouse. Anything but the truth staring them in the face. Someone was killing with purpose. Someone who knew the old ways. Someone who wanted the police to see the signs and fail to understand them. And fail they did, because on the 12th day after the first murder, the police received the only message the killer ever sent. 3 words, painted on the side of a church, in blood, war of spirits. Most cities have crime. New Orleans has atmosphere. Fear don't settle here like it does elsewhere. It marinates. It mixes with humidity, crawls into people's clothes, and whispers from the corners of alleys, older than the country itself. And when those 3 words appeared in dripping red strokes across the side of St. Augustine's Church, War of Spirits, the air changed. The quarter went from uneasy to terrified. When the police first saw that message, they didn't say a word. Not to the crowd gathering behind them, not to the priest who stood trembling on the church steps, not even to each other. They just stared, because everyone recognized the letters carved into the wall. Same angular slashes found on the bodies, same deliberate hand, same intent. But it wasn't just the message written there, it was the force behind it, the audacity. The killer hadn't chosen an alley wall or the shutters of some abandoned house. They'd chosen sacred ground, holy ground, a place where prayers were whispered for protection, where sins were confessed, where candles were lit to keep the darkness out. And the killer put their signature on it like a dare. The police cordoned off the area, ordered the crowd back, and scraped the blood into glass jars. But the people standing there, old women clutching rosaries, young men exchanging looks of dread, weren't fooled. They knew this wasn't just murder. It was a declaration, a message to the living and the dead. And just as the officers turned to leave, someone in the crowd murmured the words everyone had been thinking. The spirits ain't done. Now let me take you back to how Beau LeClair remembers that week. The way folks talked, the way the city breathed. I wasn't there in 22, but I learned this story from people who were. Folks who lived long enough to watch superstition turn into fact. Folks who hid behind shutters while the quarter held its breath, and every one of them said the same thing. Once that writing went up, we knew somebody had opened a door they couldn't close. That door swung wider when the next body appeared. 3 days after the church was marked, a housekeeper found a corpse inside a courtyard on Toulouse Street. The man had been placed on a bed of broken glass, intentionally, ritualistically, and his arms were spread wide like a crucifix. Across his chest, carved with brutal precision, was a new symbol no one recognized. But the real horror was his mouth. It wasn't just sewn shut this time. No, the stitches weren't fabric or thread. They were thin, braided strips of hair. Human hair twisted into cord and looped through his lips in tight, painful knots. Whoever had done it took their time, enough to weave strands together like rope. and tucked inside the knot at the corner of his mouth, a gris-gris pouch. This one wasn't small, not discreet, not something that could pass as a charm. It bulged with bones, feathers, and something else, something slick and dark that the coroner refused to log in his report. He burned the pouch in his furnace instead, but the smell lingered for days, so thick it clung to his clothes. Some said he started drinking after that, unable to sleep without seeing those knotted cords of hair pulling the man's lips shut. The violence was escalating. The police knew it, the quarter knew it, even the church knew it. And as the symbols carved into the victims grew more complex, twisting, intersecting, spiraling like maps to an unseen hell, rumors started spiraling even faster. Some said a rogue mambo, a priestess trained wrong, trained dark, was behind the murders. Someone seeking power the old ways forbade. Someone calling on spirits, not meant for the living. Others whispered it was a secret society, an underground sect with roots older than Congo Square. A group said to worship petro spirits, the hot-tempered ones, the ones who don't bargain, the ones who take. And then there were those who insisted the murders were retaliation. Revenge against the city's crackdown on voodoo temples, against priests and priestesses forced into hiding, against the church trying to choke out beliefs it never understood. But the theory that rattled the quarter hardest was the one spoken behind bolted doors, whispered only when the candles burned low. It ain't human. Stories spread of a figure seen on rooftops just before a body turned up. A tall silhouette moving wrong, too smooth, too silent. Of footprints appearing in courtyards where gates were locked from inside. Of dogs howling in the same alley every night at the same hour, always facing the same dark corner. Police dismissed the sightings. People did not, because New Orleans had always known the difference between human evil and something older. But whether it was spirit or flesh didn't change the fact that someone or something was killing, and the police needed help they didn't want to admit they needed. That's when Detective Leon Boot stepped beyond the law. Boot was different from the other officers, born in Tremy, learned both the catechism and the old chants before he could read. His grandmother had been a known healer, respected enough to be left alone, even by the moral police. He knew the veves carved into the bodies weren't random scratches. He knew gris-gris sewn into flesh wasn't done lightly. He knew this wasn't madness, it was ritual. And though he hid it from his superiors, he visited the one person in the quarter the police were forbidden to consult, an old conjure woman known as Tante Fleur. Now every neighborhood has one. A midwife, a healer, a keeper of stories older than the city itself. But Tante Fleur wasn't just any root worker. She'd been present at ceremonies that were shut down by the police in the early 1900s. She'd tended altars older than electricity. She'd kept names alive that had gone quiet decades before. And when Detective Boot showed her the photographs of the bodies, she didn't gasp or pray or recoil. She went silent. Then she traced her finger over one particular symbol, a forked veve carved into the stomach of the fourth victim, and whispered, "You ain't hunting a man. You hunting a message." Pooty pressed her, asked what the symbol meant. She refused, shook her head, said some knowledge was meant only for the initiated. But when he insisted, when he begged, she gave him one clue. That mark calls. The one who carved it. He was asking the spirits to open a road. Boot asked, "A road to what?" And she answered, "Not what, who." She told him the murders weren't random. They weren't rage. Each body was part of a sequence. The symbols formed an invocation, a long, slow drum beat meant to summon something that shouldn't be summoned, something dangerous, something that feeds on offerings. "Offerings like bodies?" Boot asked. Tante Fleur nodded. "Then why the veves? Why the blood symbols? Why the gris-gris bag sewn inside the flesh? And she looked him dead in the eye and said something that rattled him to his core. Because he ain't just killing them. He's gifting them. Boot left with goosebumps crawling cold up his arms. He couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. Every symbol from every photograph burned behind his eyelids like lanterns swaying in a storm. Because Tante Fleur hadn't said the killer. She'd said he. She knew something the police didn't. But she also hadn't told him everything. For instance, she hadn't explained why the symbols were carved into different parts of each body. Chest, shoulder, stomach, thigh. Why each gris-gris pouch contained different items. Why every murder took place within walking distance of Congo Square, as if the killer needed the bodies close to that ground. She hadn't said it, but Boot knew the answer. He was building something, a ritual, a sequence, a pattern, and like any ritual worth its salt, the last part hadn't happened yet. Boot returned to the station and tried to convince his captain to allow him to expand the investigation, bring in outside help, interview root workers. The captain refused, said the murders were just crime, not swamp superstition. Said the church was already breathing down his neck. Said the mayor wanted results, not stories, so Baute worked alone. But even alone he wasn't fast enough. Because while he was arguing with his captain, another body appeared. This one changed everything. A 12-year-old boy, found behind a shuttered shop near Bourbon Street. Not a sailor, not a prostitute, not a gambler, a child. The quarter shook. Mothers barred their doors. Men patrolled the streets with lanterns and pistols. Even the bootleggers refused to work at night. The killings had crossed a line no one could excuse or ignore. And the body. Lord help us, the body was the worst yet. The boy's skin was carved head to toe, not deep enough to kill him, but deep enough to scare him, to mark him, to prepare him. Because unlike the others, the boy hadn't died from wounds. He'd been suffocated, buried alive under layers of linen soaked in something that smelled like camphor, sage, and blood. And when they lifted the cloth, his eyes were still open. In his small right hand, clenched tight enough to snap bones, was a shredded piece of paper. Booty took it gently, uncurled the fingers, and unfolded the note. One symbol stared back at him, the same veve carved on every body, but this time drawn perfectly, and beneath it, a single word, more. Boot knew then, the ritual wasn't finished, and the killer wasn't close to done. When a child dies, the city changes its posture. Pride shrinks. Streets go quiet. Even the sinners bow their heads, because death is one thing, but the death of a child, and in that way, bruises the whole place like a thumbprint from God. After the boy was found, New Orleans wasn't the same. The quarter didn't hum. It held its breath. Even the jazz softened, like the horns knew better than to tempt the dark. Detective Boot barely slept that night. The boy's body haunted him. Not just the carved skin, not just the way his fingers clutched that crumpled message, but the expression frozen on his face. Terror and awe mixed together, like he'd seen something he couldn't understand, but recognized anyway. Something familiar to the old stories his grandmother used to whisper, something that didn't belong to the world of the living. And the note, that single veve drawn with a steady hand, the same mark carved across all the other bodies, stayed folded in Boot's pocket, burning against his chest like a coal. That, and the one word written beneath it, more. It felt less like a threat and more like a promise. Boot spent the morning walking the edges of Congo Square alone, trying to make sense of the patterns. He knew enough about the old ways to understand that veves weren't random shapes. They were invitations, keys drawn in chalk or powder to open spiritual doors. Each line meant something, each curve called a different echo, and if the killer was carving them into bodies, that meant he wasn't just killing. He was using the dead, calling through them. The city didn't know any of this, of course. People believed whatever made them sleep easier. A cult, a gang, a butcher gone mad. No one wanted to believe the murders had purpose. If they had purpose, then they had direction. And if they had direction, then they weren't going to stop. Beau knew he needed help, not from the police, not from the church, but from someone who understood the symbols the way a musician understands sheet music. Someone who could read the carvings the way a priest reads scripture. But the city had driven most of those people underground. Root workers operated in shadows. Mambos and houngans practiced behind boarded windows. The spiritual order that once guided the community had fractured, split into bitter rivalries. But there was one name that kept surfacing: Mother Estelle. Some said she was the last priestess, trained under a lineage that traced back to Saint-Domingue. Others claimed she'd known Marie Laveau's daughter or granddaughter, depending on who told the story. Some whispered she'd retired years ago, tired of the police raids, tired of the church condemning her, tired of the young ones chasing power without discipline. The problem was nobody knew how to find her. She didn't advertise, didn't take clients, didn't join the ceremonies at St. John's Eve. The old folks said she only came out when the spirits themselves asked her to. Beau decided to ask anyway. He went back to Tante Fleur with the boy's photograph. Not the picture the newspapers saw, but the one the coroner took before removing the gris-gris pouch. Fleur didn't want to look, but when the detective insisted, she dragged her finger along the carved lines, tracing the symbol with a trembling hand. "Not him again," she whispered. Beau froze. "You know who did this?" "No," she answered, voice heavy as wet cloth. "But I know what they worship, and why the children matter." He waited. She didn't speak. "Tante," he pushed, "this is murder. Help me stop it." But she shook her head like a mourner shaking grief away. "This is bigger than murder. This is a path. And paths, once started, must finish where they're meant to." He clenched his jaw. "Then tell me where it's going." Finally, after a long silence, she began talking. Not to him, but to the wall behind him, like she was speaking to the spirits, listening through the cracks in her house. Long before this city had priests or laws, long before the cathedral cast its shadow, the people who came here brought their spirits with them. Some sweet, some cruel, some meant for healing, and some meant for war. There was one spirit, a crossroads spirit, who answered only to blood, not sacrifice, blood. It don't want devotion, it wants currency. Beau felt his stomach tighten. "Currency? Every spirit's got a price," she whispered. "This one's price is fear." Fear. The city had plenty of that now. "But why the veves?" Beau asked. "Why sew gris-gris into the flesh? Why carve the symbols deeper each time?" Tante Fleur leaned back, hands trembling in her lap. "Because he's not just calling, he's mapping. He's trying to draw the spirit from one world into this one. Every marking on every body expands the doorway." "And the boy," Beau whispered, her eyes closed. "The boy was the midpoint. That hit him harder than any bullet could have. If he's building something, what happens at the end?" Fleur looked sick when she answered. "The last body won't be carved. It'll be crowned." Beau stepped back. Crowned. That meant a host, a vessel. The killer wasn't just finishing a ritual. He was preparing for possession. Someone was going to wear the spirit. Someone alive. And that someone mattered more than every body found so far. Bud left with panic clawing his insides. He returned to the precinct and begged the captain to let him post more patrols in the quarter. The captain called him hysterical, said the newspapers were stirring nonsense, said the church was demanding a crackdown on occult panic. Beau didn't argue. He didn't have time. He slipped out the back door and headed for Rampart Street, the edge of Congo Square. because something in him said the next phase of the ritual wouldn't wait. He was right. That night, dogs across the quarter started howling, not barking, howling, long and mournful, like they were grieving something before it happened. People shut their shutters. Lamps were lit. The air thickened with that heavy metallic scent New Orleans gets when a storm is coming, even though the sky was clear. Boot followed the howls. They led him down to a narrow alley behind a shuttered jazz club, a place where the walls sweat music when the band played, and ghosts when it didn't. The alley was silent except for the steady dripping of something wet hitting the cobblestone. He drew his revolver and stepped forward. That's when he saw the blood. A trail, not splattered, not smeared, a line, drawn. It led to a closed wooden door at the back of the club. A door marked with chalk, months ago, by a root worker who operated a candle stand in the mornings, a sign of blessing once. But now the chalk mark looked warped, as if someone had smeared it with a bloody hand. Boat pushed the door open. Inside was a room lit by one candle, placed in the center of the floor, surrounded by a circle of bones. Animal bones arranged deliberately, pointing inward like spears, and in the center of that circle lay the fourth adult victim. The butcher from the docks, the one reported missing earlier that week. His skin had been carved deeper than any before. Veves spiraled across his chest and down his arms. His eyes were open but filmed over. Boot stepped forward, slowly, because something in the room felt wrong. The air seemed thicker than before, as if the room itself was watching him. He leaned close to the body, trying to read the symbols, when something caught his eye. The gris-gris pouch sewn into the man's stomach was moving. Boot's breath hitched. He leaned closer. The pouch twitched again, not from wind, not from settling, but from something alive inside the stitched flesh. And then, in a moment that haunted him forever, the pouch ripped its own stitches. Something black spilled out. Not liquid, not alive, something like soot and shadow. A smoke that didn't rise. It crawled downward, hugging the floor like it had weight. Boot stepped back instantly, gun raised, heart pounding hard enough to bruise bone. The smoke slid toward the candle. As it touched the flame, the light sputtered, dimmed, then surged high, burning white instead of yellow. And in the wall beside the candle, a shadow took shape. Tall, human, but wrong. Arms too long, head cocked to one side like it was listening. A shape with no face but the faint outline of a mouth that opened slowly, forming a sound Boot couldn't hear, but felt in his spine. This wasn't the killer. This was the thing the killer was calling. Boot fired. The candle shattered. The room went black, and the shadow vanished. He ran from the club, stumbling down the alley, breath ragged, hands shaking harder than he'd admit to anyone. He didn't stop until he reached the street, where lantern light washed over him like a blessing. He kept turning, kept checking behind him, because he swore the darkness was following. But the darkness didn't need to follow. It was already spreading, because the next morning the killings escalated. 2 bodies found. One near the river, one in the quarter, both carved with symbols that overlapped, as if completing each other. The ritual was accelerating, and Boot now knew one thing with terrifying clarity. The killer wasn't just building toward a final victim. He was preparing a throne. By the time the 6th and 7th bodies surfaced, the murders had stopped being a crime story and turned into a sickness that hung over the French Quarter like swamp fog. Every window shutter seemed to close earlier. Every streetcar ran a little quieter. Every tavern emptied out long before midnight. Even the musicians, men who could play through fistfights, hurricanes, and heartbreak, felt the heaviness pressing on their shoulders, making their notes fall softer, slower, like the air itself was warning them not to wake whatever was walking between the buildings. New Orleans is a loud city by nature, a place that laughs at darkness and plays a horn in its face But that summer it went unnaturally still, as if the rhythm of the place, the heartbeat of it, had been hollowed out. Detective Leon Boot was moving through that silence with the look of a man who hadn't slept in days. He no longer pretended this was a hunt for a murderer. He carried the knowledge of something far older, something that had crawled out of the shadows and was now watching him from the edges of vision. He walked the quarter the way a priest walks into a dying man's house, slow, solemn, expecting the next breath to carry a stench he didn't want to name. His superiors continued insisting the killings were the work of a lunatic, a butcher with delusions, a cultist inspired by superstition. But Boot knew that explanation broke under the weight of the carved symbols, the sewn gris-gris, the precision of the ritual. Nothing about this was chaotic. Nothing was careless. Each body felt constructed, like chapters in a book written for an audience that existed somewhere beyond human understanding. What troubled him most was the shift in the killings after the child. The adults who died afterward weren't chosen randomly. Their bodies were laid out in a specific pattern across the city map. One near the docks, one close to the cathedral, one just outside Congo Square, one behind a brothel on Dauphine, another in a cramped courtyard beside a Creole townhouse. If you drew lines from one body to the next, you didn't get chaos. You got shape, you got symmetry, you got a symbol spreading across New Orleans itself, as though the killer were carving veves into the city, the same way he carved them into flesh. Boots spread the map across his desk and stared at the lines for hours. The detectives around him shuffled papers and tried to ignore the ragged look in his eyes. But none of them could deny what the chalk traced. A geometric pattern matching the older veves photographed from the early murders. The killer wasn't just leaving symbols on bodies, he was placing bodies to reflect symbols. The quarter itself had become the canvas. Boot knew he needed to talk to Mother Estelle, whether she wanted to be found or not. Tante Fleur had told him the midpoint had already been chosen with the boy's death, which meant the ritual was nearing its final act. If the killer was planning to crown someone, a living host for the spirit he was calling, then Boot had days, maybe hours, to stop him. But the old priestess wasn't easy to locate. Every shopkeeper and midwife he questioned grew pale when he mentioned her name, not out of fear, but out of respect. You don't go knocking on the door of someone who stands halfway between this world and the next, unless you're ready to accept whatever answer you get. Boot kept searching, though. Every hour wasted was another hour for the killer to complete the pattern. He found her in a place no one expected, sitting beneath a magnolia tree behind an old convent on Governor Nichols Street. Her back straight, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes watching him as though she'd been waiting. She looked smaller than legend suggested, soft-spoken, with hair silvered by age, and a posture that hinted at pain she'd lived with so long she hardly noticed it anymore. But her presence was strong. It filled the courtyard like warm wind. She didn't let him speak first. She simply nodded toward the bench across from her and said, "You've brought trouble with you." Boot sat heavily, rubbing a hand over his face. He explained the bodies, the veves, the boy, the ritual sequence he'd mapped. She listened without interrupting, her gaze steady, her breath calm, as though none of what he described surprised her. When he finished, she closed her eyes. "What you're chasing does not belong to you," she said quietly, "nor to the law, nor to the church. It belongs to the old things, the ones who were here before the ships, before the priests, before the streets had names." Boot leaned forward. "I don't care who it belongs to," he answered. "It's killing people. It's hurting children." She nodded slowly, almost mournfully. "That is because someone has dared to wake something that never should have been called. The spirit he's summoning is not one that blesses. It does not heal. It does not serve. It takes. It devours. It answers to fear, and it answers only when called through blood." Boot asked her who he was, hoping for a name, a silhouette, a clue, but Estelle shook her head. "I cannot tell you that," she said. "The one who calls wears two faces. One the living see, one the spirits recognize. You will know him only when he wishes you to." Beau resisted the urge to curse. He wanted clarity, facts, names, things the police department could use, but he also knew he couldn't afford to dismiss the truth standing in front of him simply because it didn't fit a report. So he asked instead, "What happens when the pattern is complete?" She opened her eyes then, and Beau felt the weight in her gaze, like a hand pressing against his chest. "When the last mark is placed," she said, "the spirit crosses, not in smoke, not in shadow. It crosses into a living person. That person becomes its vessel, its crown." He swallowed hard. "A child?" "No," she whispered. "The child was the middle point, the hinge. The final vessel must be strong. Strong in body, strong in grief, strong in rage, a person close to death but not yet claimed. Someone balanced on the edge, an open door." Beau stood abruptly. He didn't want to hear any more. He didn't want this prophecy, this omen, this doom spoken aloud. But Estelle wasn't finished. "Detective," she said softly, "you've already met him?" The words struck him like a blow. He opened his mouth to protest, to argue, but she lifted a hand before he could speak. "Not the vessel," she clarified, "the one seeking to fill it." He went still. "Find him," she said. "Break the pattern. Close the road he's building. Once the final veve is carved, no man will stop what crosses." Beau left with those words carved into his ribs, deeper than any symbol. He hurried toward the quarter with a cold certainty forming in his gut, not a supernatural vision or a whisper from spirits, but the detective's instinct he'd long relied on. Someone he'd questioned, someone he'd passed on the street, someone who had watched him with more interest than he realized, someone who had been tracing bodies across the city like a hunter marking territory. He retraced his steps through the investigation, walking past every crime scene, repeating every name involved, combing through every report. And then, hours later, standing beneath a flickering street lamp on Burgundy Street, it clicked. The butcher, the missing butcher whose body he found behind the jazz club. The man wasn't supposed to be part of the ritual. His body had been a deviation in the pattern. Found too early, carved too shallow, placed off-center. That body wasn't a chapter in the ritual. It was disposal. The real butcher, the killer, was still out there. And the body behind the club had been planted to throw the police off. Beau realized the killer was someone with access to the docks. Someone comfortable handling flesh. Someone strong enough to carve bodies with precision. But more than that. Someone who understood veves intimately. Someone with knowledge, not learned in books or stolen from street corner charlatans. Someone trained. Someone the old root workers would never trust enough to speak of. The vessel wasn't the butcher was the bait. Beau moved quickly, retracing the last route the butcher was known to walk, the docks along the river. He questioned sailors, deckhands, stevedores. Most claimed ignorance. But one man, a fisherman with trembling hands and eyes that refused to meet his, finally whispered something useful. "There's a man," he said. "Tall, pale, carries a satchel with bones inside, comes to the wharf every time the tide turns. He don't buy fish. He watches the river like he's waiting on it to speak." Beau asked where he lived. The fisherman pointed south, toward an abandoned warehouse near the old levee. As Beau approached the structure, the smell struck him first. Not rot, not blood. Something older, something sweet and metallic, like bones boiled in herbs. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. There were candles everywhere, burning low, illuminating symbols carved into the floorboards. Veves drawn in salt, ash, and dried river clay. And in the center of the room, seated, cross-legged, with a calmness that did not belong to a sane man, was the killer. Beau recognized him instantly. Not from reports, not from witness descriptions, but from the shape of the darkness inside him. The man smiled. "You're late," he said. Boot raised his gun. "Stand up." The man didn't move. "I told the spirits you'd come. They asked for you. You've been walking their road without knowing it." "Stand up," Boot repeated, stepping forward. The candlelight flickered, and the symbols on the ground began to pulse, softly at first, then with a rhythm like distant drums. The man lifted his hands, palms upward, as though offering himself to something Boot couldn't see. "It's ready," he whispered. "The pattern is complete." Boot looked down and understood the truth too late. The veves on the floor formed a final symbol, a crown, and the spirit the killer had been calling was already inside the room. The warehouse near the levee had always been an ugly thing, a forgotten shell of timber and rusted iron slumped at the river's edge like a drunk who never made it home. But that night, it felt alive. The air inside vibrated with a slow, deliberate pulse, as if the walls themselves had lungs, drawing shallow breaths. Detective Liam Boot had walked into dangerous rooms before. Rooms with armed men, rooms with desperate men, rooms where the air carried the stinging bitterness of gunpowder. But nothing in his long career prepared him for the quiet, watchful dread that filled that space. It was the kind of heaviness that made the hair rise on the back of his neck, the kind that reminded him of stories his grandmother used to whisper when she thought he was asleep. Stories about shadows that weren't empty, about crossroads that bent more than just roads, about spirits that waited centuries to be spoken to. The man sitting cross-legged in the center of the warehouse floor was calm in a way that made Boot's stomach twist. His hands rested gently on his knees, his shoulders relaxed, his breathing slow and measured, like he'd been practicing for this exact moment. Around him, dozens of candles flickered low, their flames fat and trembling, casting long silhouettes that swayed across symbols drawn on the floorboards. These weren't amateur scrawls. These were veves laid with precision, lines of salt, ash, powdered bone, and river clay, arranged in interlocking patterns that matched the marks carved into the murdered bodies. Boat recognized several immediately. He'd stared at them long enough in coroner photographs to see them burned into his eyelids, but the symbol, directly beneath the man, was the one that made his breath hitch. It was circular but crowned by sharp, upward-pointing shapes. 5 of them, evenly spaced, like a sunburst or a crown. It reminded him of the veve drawn on the child's hidden note, except larger and more deliberate, more complete. This, Boot realized, was the final mark, the mark Estelle had warned him about, the mark that didn't belong on dead flesh because it was meant for the living. The man lifted his chin slightly when Boot stepped closer, as though acknowledging the detective's arrival as part of a script already written. His voice was quiet, smooth, almost polite. "Detective," he murmured, "you came exactly when you needed to." "Stand up," Boot said, keeping his revolver trained on the man's chest. He spoke firmly, but his voice carried a tightness he couldn't hide. He had faced killers before, but this one radiated a certainty that made Boot feel like he was the one intruding, rather than the one in control. "I told the spirits you would come," the man said. His eyes didn't hold malice or defiance. They held something far more unsettling: reverence. "You walked their road without knowing it. You followed every sign." "I said stand up," Boot repeated, taking another slow step, careful not to disturb the salt lines. "You can't break the pattern now," the man answered, almost sympathetically. "It's already set. All the marks are placed. The offering's made. The door is open." Boot forced himself to focus. "You carved into bodies. You murdered working men and women. You killed a child. That door's going to close on your neck." The man smiled faintly. "They weren't victims. They were vessels, steps, each one placed exactly where the spirit needed them. A road cannot be built from a single stone." His words crawled across the room like cold insects. Boot had heard criminals justify their crimes in 1,000 twisted ways, but this man wasn't just excusing the violence. He believed he'd been following instructions older than himself, older than the city, older than anything New Orleans recognized under the laws of men. The candles flickered suddenly, all at once, as if stirred by a breeze Boot couldn't feel. The flames bowed inward, bending toward the man in the center like flowers seeking sunlight. Boot felt a prickling in the air, a tingling pressure beneath his skin, as though something was moving just beyond sight. "Stand up," Boot said again, but this time even he heard the hesitation in his voice. The man exhaled deeply and finally rose, slow and deliberate. He was taller than Boot expected, with long limbs and a frame that seemed to stretch unnaturally in the candlelight's wavering glow. His movements were fluid, almost graceful, as though his joints had loosened from the world's ordinary constraints. Boot lifted the gun higher, tightening his grip, but the man didn't flinch. "You think I'm the threat," the man said softly. "But I'm only the messenger. The bridge. The spirit isn't entering me." He paused, tilting his head slightly. "I'm just the one who clears the ground." "Then who's it entering?" Boot asked, each word cutting into the thick air like a knife. The fear that had been slowly blooming inside him finally unfurled. The man's smile widened with something dangerously close to tenderness. "You know the answer." Boot froze. "No," he whispered under his breath. "No." The man nodded slowly. "You are strong. You are grieving. You are angry. You walk with one foot in the world of the living and one foot in the world of the dead. A perfect hinge between both. The spirits have been circling you since the second body fell." "Stop." Boot's voice cracked. "Stop talking. You feel them," the man continued gently. "Every night. The pressure, the humming, the shadows that follow you home. You think you're hunting them, detective, but they've been choosing you." Boot stepped back, shaking his head. He felt sweat gather at the base of his neck, and for the first time since the murders began, he wished he had never opened the first case file. He wished he had never seen the symbols. He wished he had never walked into this warehouse, never heard Estelle say that the final vessel must be strong enough to carry what waited on the other side. He thought of the boy, the midpoint, the hinge. He thought of the butcher, discarded as a false trail. He thought of the veves carved across the city like a net tightening around him. "This ritual ends tonight," Boot said, but the resolve in his voice was more stubbornness than certainty. The man stepped forward, the candle flames stretching toward him, their shadows lengthening along the walls like skeletal fingers. Boot aimed and fired. The gunshots split the warehouse air like a whip crack, ringing off the rusted beams overhead. The man staggered, his body jerking hard as the bullet punched through his shoulder. But he didn't fall. He simply straightened, lips curling into a faint grin, and lifted his wounded arm as though displaying an offering. "Blood is welcome," he murmured. "It feeds the crossing." Before Boot could fire again, the ground beneath the veve trembled. It wasn't a vibration or a simple shake. It was a shift, deep and resonant, like something heavy pressing against the world from underneath. The drawn lines of salt shivered. The candle flames rose higher, stretching into long, hungry spears of light. Boot felt pressure on his chest, tightening, squeezing his lungs as though invisible fingers had wrapped around him. And then the room changed. The shadows on the walls thickened, darkening into shapes with depth and weight. They didn't move like shadows. They moved like beings. The sound came next, low and thrumming, like a dozen voices humming the same note from far beneath the riverbed. Boot's pulse hammered in his ears. Something was entering the room. The killer clasped his hands together, lifted his face toward the ceiling, and let out a long, trembling breath. "It's here," he whispered. "He's here." Boot staggered back, fighting the crushing sensation building around him. He tried to lift his gun again, but the air felt like syrup, thick and resistant. The candle flames twisted, distorting into elongated spirals before snapping upright again. The veve on the ground pulsed like a beating heart. The shadows moved toward Boot. He felt it then, not a touch, but a presence, a cold awareness sliding beneath his skin like ice water. His breath shallow, his heartbeat unsteady, his vision narrowing. He didn't hear a voice with his ears, but something inside him recognized the intention just the same. It wanted him. The killer's voice echoed softly, his tone filled with awe. He's choosing. Boot felt panic claw up his throat. He stepped back, Boot scraping along the salt lines. The veve pulsed again, harder this time, and the pressure nearly buckled his knees. But something else cut through, the suffocating force. A faint sound, a flutter, a whisper. Boot blinked, disoriented, trying to locate the source. It wasn't coming from the killer. It wasn't coming from the shadows. It was coming from the far corner of the warehouse. A soft, rhythmic tapping. Boot squinted into the dark. A figure stood there, small, hunched, trembling. Tante Fleur, she had followed him. And she was chanting. Not loud, not demanding. A steady murmur, low and heavy like a prayer spoken underwater. The shadows paused, rippling, turning toward her. Her voice vibrated through the air, cut through the pressure like a blade sliding between ribs. The killer's face twisted with fury. "No," he hissed. "You cannot intervene." Fleur took another step forward, her chant deepening, her hands trembling violently. She was old, too old to carry this kind of ritual weight, but she forced the words through her teeth, like someone pulling a rope from a well. The veve flickered, the shadows recoiled, the pressure around Boot loosened enough for him to inhale fully, for the first time in minutes. He stumbled back, gasping, clutching his chest. Fleur's voice grew louder, more desperate, drawing on reserves of strength she didn't have. She chanted the way someone fights, knowing they won't survive the battle, but choosing to step forward anyway. The killer lunged toward her. Boot reacted faster than thought. He threw himself at the man, tackling him onto the salt lines, breaking the edge of the veve. The candles sputtered violently as the boundary shattered. Fleur gave one final cry, a command, a rejection, a barrier thrown up with the last breath she had left. The warehouse exploded with wind. The candles snuffed out, the shadows convulsed, the ritual broke, and Tante Fleur collapsed. When the warehouse went dark, it wasn't the darkness of a room with no lights. It was the darkness of something that had been pushed out of the world too fast, something leaving a bruise behind. For several seconds after Tante Fleur collapsed, there was no sound at all, except the clicking drip of cooling candle wax and the ragged, uneven breaths of Detective Léon Boot. He felt his way along the floorboards for his revolver, fingers slipping, across dust, broken salt lines, and splinters until he finally closed his hand around the metal grip. He rose slowly, muscles still trembling with the aftershock of whatever force had tried to claim him. The killer, if he could still be called that, lay sprawled on the warehouse floor, half in and half out of what remained of the veve. His chest rose and fell in uneven shudders. The expression on his face had changed. The maddened devotion had peeled away, replaced with something like grief. Raw, furious grief, as though someone had stolen his life's one true purpose in the space of a heartbeat. Boot stepped toward Tante Fleur. She lay crumpled on her side, arms curled inward, her body almost floating in the dim outline of moonlight, bleeding through gaps in the warehouse roof. He knelt beside her with the kind of gentleness reserved for saints and dying kin, brushing her hair back from her forehead. "Fleur," he whispered, his voice cracking around the edges. "Talk to me." Her eyes fluttered open, not fully, just enough for him to see the faint gleam of awareness inside them. She made no effort to move. Her limbs were still. Her voice came out in a rasp that sounded like wind dragging itself across old stone. "Child, you must finish it." Boot swallowed hard. He had expected her to say something comforting or prophetic. Instead, she spoke like a woman who knew her time was measured in breaths, and she didn't intend to waste a single one on anything but the truth. "It isn't over," she whispered. Stopping him wasn't enough. Boot leaned closer. "The ritual's broken, the circle shattered. The spirit can't." She forced a small, pained smile. "It doesn't need a circle, not once it's been invited." Every muscle in Boot's body tightened. He felt the air shift, not physically, emotionally, the same way a church feels different after a long funeral, or a battlefield feels different when the last gunshot fades, but the smell of gunpowder lingers like an accusation. Something had crossed the threshold. Something still lingered. "The spirit is loose," she murmured, her breath growing thinner. "It is not crowned, but it is here." Boot looked around the warehouse, suddenly aware of how still the shadows had become. This wasn't the watchful, gathering darkness from minutes earlier. It was emptier now, but still wrong. Lighter than before, but not clean. He felt it in his bones. Something was hovering, newly severed from its intended host, confused, hungry, seeking direction. "Where is it?" Boot breathed, scanning the rafters, the corners, the doorway. Fleur's hand twitched weakly in the direction of the killer. Boot turned. The man was standing, slowly, mechanically, like a puppet rediscovering its strings. His back was arched, his head tilted at an unnatural angle, his arms hanging slack but trembling as though fighting against invisible restraints. His eyes, God help, Boot, were no longer the eyes of the man he'd been moments ago. They were glassy and unfocused, reflecting candlelight that no longer existed, as if staring at something far behind the detective. Boot raised his gun. "Don't move." The thing wearing the man's skin jerked its head toward him, the motion too sharp, too sudden, like the neck bones bent in ways they were never meant to. The killer's mouth opened, stretching wider than before, pulling at the skin of his cheeks until it looked like it might split. No sound came out at first. Then, slowly, a whisper seeped through the cracked lips. "Not him." Boot felt those words in his throat, like an icy hand closing around his windpipe. He didn't understand what the spirit meant, but he didn't have time to ask. The killer's body spasmed violently, jerking forward in uneven bursts, hands curling into claws. The man stumbled one step toward Boot, then another, then dropped to his knees, as though forced there by a weight on his shoulders. Fleur coughed weakly. "It hasn't crowned him. It can't stay in a body that broken. It's searching." "For what?" Boot whispered. Fleur's eyes drifted to him. "You." Boot felt the world tilt inside his skull. The idea that something ancient, hungry, and wounded was circling him like a hawk waiting to land made his hands tremble. He tightened his grip on the revolver. Though he knew bullets didn't matter to spirits that traveled between worlds, the man's body lunged with sudden force, arms stretching outward as though something inside him had tried to leap forward. His chest convulsed, his spine arched. Boot saw a ripple, like heat rising from a road on a summer day, pass through the man's torso, up his throat, and behind his eyes. Then the killer collapsed fully, face down on the boards, his limbs finally still. But the room did not feel emptier. It felt more crowded. Bout aimed the revolver at the shadows, though he knew instinctively that if the spirit wished to claim him, it wouldn't attack his body first. It would attack his fear. It would speak where words had no sound. It would follow him into the cracks of his mind. Fleur whispered again, "You must finish what he started. But turn it." Boot blinked. "Turn it?" Her breath shuddered. Spirits follow roads. They follow veves. They follow patterns. He built one to bring the spirit in. You must build one to send it back. He stared helplessly at the scattered salt lines, the broken veve, the half-burned candles. "I don't know how." "You know enough," she breathed. "You've seen enough. The pattern is in your head. Boot didn't believe that. He couldn't. The veves were complex, twisting, layered with meanings he barely understood. Still, he felt the weight of her certainty pushing into him like a hand on his spine. He had no other choice. If the spirit remained rootless, uncrowned, unanchored, it would wander the quarter until something terrible happened, latching onto anger, grief, violence, despair. For all he knew, it was already brushing against the thoughts of every person awake in the night, searching for the right doorway. Fleur's voice thinned. "Hurry." Boots stood slowly. The warehouse floorboards creaked, the sound echoing like a warning. He approached the broken veve, trying to recall the forms from memory. The intersections, the curves, the angles. He dragged his boot through the ruined salt, clearing the lines. Then he reached for a fallen candle, snapped the wick out, and dipped a finger into the warm pool of wax. He began drawing, not perfectly, not cleanly, but deliberately. The patterns came back to him faster than he expected, as though they had already been etched into his nerves during the investigation. He painted lines across the boards, circling the broken crown-shaped points with new curves that resembled the banishment marks Fleur had described earlier. The wax cooled quickly on the wood, but it caught the moonlight in a dull glimmer. The air thickened again. Something was watching. He didn't need to see it to know. He felt the same cold pull he had experienced during the attempted crossing, felt the pressure form behind his temples, felt a tightening in his chest. The shadows on the warehouse walls began to shift again, bending unnaturally toward him. Boot drew faster, connecting lines, redirecting pathways, closing doors. Each stroke felt like a tug of war against breaths he couldn't take. The temperature dropped so sharply his skin prickled. He placed the final mark, a sweeping curve that intersected the crown symbol and sealed the pattern shut. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then everything happened at once. A wind ripped through the warehouse from nowhere, not hot or cold but impossibly heavy, like the force of 100 lungs exhaling in unison. The shadows convulsed, swirling violently before collapsing inward like smoke, being sucked through cracks in the world. The candles guttered, the boards trembled. There was a sound, not human, not animal, not wind. A howl of something defeated and enraged, dragged back toward a place where it didn't want to go. Then silence. Total. Final. The air cleared, the oppressive heaviness evaporated, and the warehouse once again became just a warehouse. Old, broken, and empty, except for Boot, a dying priestess, and a dead man who had tried to summon hell. Boot dropped to his knees, breath shaking. He didn't feel triumphant. He felt exhausted, soul deep exhausted. Fleur was watching him with the faintest smile, the kind of smile someone gives when they see a child take their first step. "It's gone," she whispered. He crawled to her side, lowering himself gently. "Fleur, stay with me. Help is coming." "No," she breathed. "My road ends here." Boot shook his head. "Don't say that." Her eyes softened. "I held the line for as long as I could. Now it's your turn." He bowed his head. Her breath slowed. "You've seen the spirits' faces," she murmured. "They'll watch you now. And you must watch them." Her final breath left her body like a sigh carried away by the river wind. Her eyes closed gently, and the tension in her limbs released all at once. Boot stayed beside her, holding her hand long after it had cooled, long after the candles had extinguished, long after the shadows settled. At dawn, he covered her with his coat, lifted her in his arms, and carried her out of the warehouse as the Mississippi rolled by, oblivious and eternal. But he did not feel alone. Something had changed in him, and something was waiting for him outside. Detective Leon Boot stepped out of the warehouse at sunrise, carrying Tante Fleur's still body against his chest. The sky over New Orleans was a bruised lavender, one of those early morning colors that only existed for a heartbeat before the sun burned it off. Down by the levee the Mississippi rolled, slow and muddy, whispering to itself, in that ancient voice the river uses when it's thinking about turning mean. Boot felt the weight of Fleur's passing pressing on him, heavier than any corpse he'd carried. She had stood between worlds, longer than any person had a right to, and now that she was gone, the invisible line she defended felt as fragile as a thread. He laid her gently on the grass beside the levee, smoothing her dress, brushing silver strands of hair from her cheek, and whispering a prayer that mixed the old Latin he learned as a boy with the Creole blessings he'd heard whispered at candlelit altars. He wanted to give her a proper burial, something with dignity, something that acknowledged what she had done for the city, but he knew he couldn't wait. The police would come soon. They would have questions. They would see the warehouse and draw the wrong conclusions. And the quarter, heavy-eyed and battered by weeks of fear, was waiting for an answer that he didn't know how to give. When he made his way back into the French Quarter, the streets were still mostly empty, but not silent. Doors creaked open one by one, as if the houses themselves were waking up from bad dreams. Shopkeepers stood half-hidden behind shutters, peering into the street as if expecting to see spirits drifting through the morning fog. Mothers clutched their children's hands a little tighter, and everywhere he looked he saw candles, burned down to stubs on windowsills, flickering weakly on stoops, standing cold and spent after burning through the night. People were waiting for the news. Boot didn't want to speak it. Not yet, not before he made sure the quarter was truly safe. But news has a way of spreading in New Orleans, even before the first word is spoken. As he walked down St. Philip Street, a woman stepped out of her doorway with a scarf tied around her hair and worry drawn deep into her face. "You found him," she said, not as a question, but like someone stating a weather pattern. "Last night's wind told us so." Boot stopped. The woman's eyes were wet, not with fear but with relief. "I found him," he replied carefully, unable to force the rest out. "And the thing he called?" she asked, lowering her voice. Boot chose his words like someone walking barefoot through glass. "It's gone," he said, "but not forgotten." She nodded once, then stepped back into her home, whispering a prayer under her breath. Boot continued down the street, but her reaction lingered in his mind. The quarter wasn't celebrating, it wasn't cheering, it was bracing. They knew something had changed. As he crossed Rampart and entered Treme, he found more people awake, sweeping their stoops, lighting incense, scattering red brick dust across their thresholds. Several nodded at him knowingly, though he hadn't spoken a word. News traveled differently in these parts. Not through headlines or coroner reports, but through whispers, dreams, and that tingling certainty behind the ribs that tells you when a storm has passed, but left something behind in its wake. He reached Congo Square just as the sun began to warm the stones. In daylight the place looked harmless, just a quiet patch of earth, dotted with trees and benches. But Boat had grown up hearing stories from elders who wouldn't walk across that square after sundown. They said the drums of the old world never stopped vibrating there, not completely. If you pressed your ear to the ground, you could hear them humming. Even now, the air above the square held a faint tremor, like the earth itself had recently been shaken. Boot stood there a long time, letting the morning light wash over him. He expected to feel relief, maybe gratitude, maybe the weight of victory. But what settled inside him was none of those things. It was a numbness, an awareness that what he had fought in that warehouse was not just an isolated incident. It had roots, deep ones. Roots braided into generations of belief and fear and devotion. He had cut one vine of a much larger thing, and the quarter would feel the severed ends for years. He turned to leave, and that's when he heard it. Soft at first, barely a whisper. A faint humming. Not human, not wind. Something in between. He froze, breath catching in his throat. The sound faded as quickly as it appeared, like a memory blinking out. Boot exhaled. Not now, he murmured quietly to himself. Not today. But he knew the truth. Spirits don't simply disappear because a ritual breaks. They shift, they wait, they linger where memory is thickest. And New Orleans, God help it, was made of memories stacked so deep they had their own gravity. He headed back toward the precinct with heavy steps. The closer he drew, the more the world seemed to return to its usual rhythm. Men carrying crates from wagons, women calling out to children playing in the street, streetcars clanging down canal, musicians tuning their horns for the day's first notes. It should have comforted him, but it didn't. His senses were stretched thin, alert to every flicker of shadow and stray whisper. He finally reached the precinct door, just as two officers stepped out, their faces drawn. "Boot," one called. "Jesus, where have you been? The captain's tearing the walls down looking for you." "I had to handle something," Boot replied. The officers exchanged looks. They smelled trouble. "We got another body," the second officer said. "Down on Burgundy. Just came in." Boot's chest tightened like a fist had closed around his lungs. "Another," he said quietly. "This morning." "Must have been killed before dawn," the first replied. "Looks like the others." Boot felt the world tilt again, that old sickening sensation that meant something had slipped past him. He followed the officers down the street in a tight, fast walk, his nerves flaring with dread he didn't want to acknowledge. They crossed into a narrow passage behind a row of decaying homes, pushing through a gate that sagged on one hinge. The body lay in the corner of an overgrown courtyard, half hidden beneath a collapsed trellis. A young man, maybe 20. Shirt torn, skin marked, hands clenched. His mouth hung open, and his eyes were wide, with the same terror Boot had seen on all the others. The officers stepped back to give him space. Boot knelt slowly. The first thing he checked was the symbols carved into the flesh. They were crude, uneven, jagged, shallow, not the careful etching he'd seen in the others, not part of a ritual. The lines were sloppy, rushed, unsure, not the killer, a copycat. Boot closed his eyes and let out a slow breath. He wasn't angry, he wasn't even relieved, he was simply tired. Always in New Orleans the line between belief and fear blurred, and men rushed to claim power they didn't understand. Someone had heard the rumors about the killings, seen the fear spreading across the quarter, and decided to imitate it for reasons Boot didn't care to guess. It didn't matter. The damage was done. The quarter would cling to the idea that the ritual hadn't ended. And in a way, they weren't wrong. Boot stood and addressed the officers. "This one isn't connected," he said firmly. "Treat it like a regular homicide." One of the officers hesitated. "You sure, Leon? Looks," I said, "treat it like a regular homicide." They nodded and moved to begin taking statements from neighbors. Boot left the courtyard, stepping into the humid morning air with a heaviness that made him feel twice his age. He knew the truth. The ritual was broken, but the shadow it cast was long. The quarter would feel its shape long after the last candle burned down. And he, whether he admitted it or not, had been marked by what happened in the warehouse. He felt it in the tingling behind his eyes when he walked through certain streets. He felt it in the heaviness in his chest when he passed Congo Square. He felt it in the humming that came and went like a phantom heartbeat. Spirits remember. They don't forget the ones who stand in their path. And New Orleans, God bless it, doesn't bury its secrets deep enough for them to stay quiet. It was near noon when he finally reached the precinct. The captain chewed him out for vanishing all night, for ignoring protocol, for chasing superstition. Boot listened without a word, letting the anger pass through him like a gust of river wind. When the rant finally ended, the captain pointed a thick finger at him. "You're off the ritual killings. That copycat was the last one." We're closing that chapter, do you understand? Boot nodded. Yes, sir, he lied. Because rituals don't end when men decide they do. That night, as Boot lit a small candle in the window of his own home, a candle he told himself was for Fleur, but knew better, he caught a glimpse of movement across the room. A ripple, a flicker, a suggestion of a shape watching him from the corner. It vanished as soon as he turned. But the humming, soft, distant, lingered in the air like a memory refusing to fade. And for the first time since the murders ended, Detective Leon Boot said a prayer not meant for the living. He prayed the spirit wasn't looking for a new road, because he already felt it stepping toward him. For most people in New Orleans, the Voodoo Murders ended the way all ugly stories end in a busy city, in a headline, then in a whisper, and then in that quiet kind of forgetting where the details fade, but the feeling remains. The papers gave it one last burst of ink. Ritual killer found dead near levee. French Quarter breathes easier as voodoo maniac stopped. City police end war of spirits panic. Editors loved that phrase. The first time a reporter used it in a column, it sounded dramatic enough to sell papers. The second time, it stuck. The third time, it became the official name. And just like that, what had happened in the alleys and courtyards of the quarter was packaged for public consumption. A madman, some carved symbols, a wave of fear, and a heroic detective who tracked him down and ended the nightmare. That's the story the city told itself. It was cleaner that way. It was easier to summarize. No need to mention Tante Fleur dying on the warehouse floor. No need to talk about veves painted in wax and salt and bone, or a spirit that almost crossed the threshold into a man sworn to uphold the law. No need to admit that the French Quarter hadn't just been frightened of a human killer, but of the possibility that something older and hungrier was walking its streets in a borrowed body. New Orleans has always had a gift for looking itself in the mirror and deciding which parts of its face it wants to acknowledge. The rest gets powder, beads, and a little extra music. In the official police files, the case was closed within a month. A folder stamped in thick black letters. Completed. Inside, photographs of carved bodies, diagrams of courtyards, witness statements half legible from sweat stains, a coroner's report listing causes of death in language so clinical it forgot to tremble. The man found dead at the levee warehouse was labeled perpetrator, his motives described as delusional, spiritual mania. The copycat killing was filed as unrelated. The earlier bodies were listed as victims in a ritualistic pattern of homicide. There was no mention of veves mapping the city, no mention of smoke that moved like thought, no mention of chanting that shook the walls harder than dynamite. Detective Leon Boot wrote one final summary for the file. It was shorter than anyone expected. A few neat paragraphs in careful cursive. It described the killer's background, the circumstances of his death, and the sequence of events that led to the conclusion of the investigation. It did not mention that Boat had watched something invisible try to crown him in a room where the air itself had bent. It did not mention that the warehouse smelled like the inside of an old crucifix and a grave at the same time. It did not mention that he still woke up at night, hearing a low humming that had nothing to do with trains, riverboats, or streetcars. Some truths belong to reports. Others belong to the spaces between heartbeats. But there was one thing Boot did that never made the paper and never found its way into that folder. Alone in his small house that autumn, long after the newspapers had moved on to other dramas, politicians, storms, ball games, scandals, he sat at his kitchen table with a lantern burning low and copied every veve he remembered into a small notebook. Not the perfect version a trained priestess might draw on a packed earth floor, but the versions he'd seen carved into flesh and marked in blood on brick. Imperfect, but true enough to disturb his sleep. On the next page, he copied the countermark he'd drawn in wax on the warehouse floor, the one the spirit had fought against before being forced back, across whatever thin veil it had managed to breach. Beneath that, he wrote 3 words, in a tight, steady hand. "Do not repeat." He wrapped the notebook in oilcloth and tucked it inside a box that already contained letters from his grandmother, his baptism certificate, and the only photograph he had of his parents. Then he slid the box under a loose board in his bedroom floor. He never spoke of it again. Some things you bury not because you're afraid of them, but because you're afraid of what someone else might do if they dug them up. The quarter healed in the way it always does, not by forgetting, but by folding the pain into its tapestry. The jazz came back full volume, horns sharp and bright, drums rolling under everything like a heartbeat that refused to stop. Tourists returned to the French Quarter, drawn by the same mix of danger and charm that had always made the place feel like it was smiling at them with just a little too much teeth. The women who sold candles and herbs from their small shops went back to advising love-struck girls and worried mothers. The men who played cards in corners of old bars went back to gossiping about business and bad luck, but if you listened closely, you could hear a new note woven into the city's music. People started saying, "Don't walk alone on Ursuline after dark, not since that summer." Shopkeepers muttered, "We don't talk about those bodies. Spirits don't like to be reminded of their failures." Grandmothers told their grandchildren, "If the church wall ever bleeds again, you run share, you don't stare." The phrase "war of spirits" passed from the newspapers into the mouths of folks who never learned to read, because it matched something they'd always understood instinctively. Sometimes the battles in New Orleans are not between men and men, but between things that don't show up on census forms. Years later, the Voodoo Murders slid out of daily conversation and into that murky space between history and myth. A few of the younger detectives heard whispers about an old case back in the 20s where bodies showed up with bags sewn into their flesh and strange signs carved into their skin. They shrugged it off as exaggeration or bourbon-soaked storytelling. One rookie found the case file in the department archives and laughed nervously at the photographs, the way someone laughs when their neck is stiff and they don't want to admit they're unsettled. "Leon Boot," someone told him. He was the one who wrapped it up, retired quiet, never talked much about it. Outside the station, the story took on a life of its own. Some said the killer had been a priest who snapped after being denied a church position. Others claimed he was a dock worker who made a pact with a river spirit and paid the price. Some insisted Tante Fleur never died. She simply stepped across the line she'd spent her life guarding and kept watch from the other side. Kids dared each other to sneak into old courtyards after dark to see if the carved signs were still there, beneath layers of paint and ivy. Street preachers used the tale as a warning against mixing spirits, alcohol, and the ones you pray to. And through it all, the French Quarter stayed what it had always been. A place where the dead lingered, the living misbehaved, and the line between the two wavered every time the lamps flickered. Which brings us to why you're hearing this from me at all. Because the thing about New Orleans is that its stories don't stay buried. They sink for a while, sure, like stones thrown off the side of a steamboat. But sooner or later, the river coughs some of them back up. Sometimes it's a yellowed clipping in a trunk. Sometimes it's a name carved into a brick. Sometimes it's an old detective's notebook found under a floorboard by a grandson, cleaning out a house that smells like tobacco and bay leaves and rain. Those police files, they're real. You can trace them if you know where to look and who to ask. You'll find references to a quiet summer when a string of bodies shook the quarter. You'll see notes about gris-gris recovered from evidence, about markings no one in authority wanted to define on paper. You'll find a picture of a church wall with 3 words, painted in something that was tested, retested, and finally recorded as human blood. War of Spirits. You'll see Leon Bout's name at the bottom of the final report. You will not find mention of the warehouse veve, or the wind that didn't blow from any direction the compass could point to. Those belong to another record, a different kind of archive, kept in the mouths of the old folks and the bones of the city itself. So when you walk the French Quarter today, maybe on a tour, maybe alone with a drink in your hand and a song leaking out of a doorway, it's easy to think of voodoo as theatrics. Dolls in shop windows, fake altars with plastic skulls, trinkets sold to tourists who want to feel like they brushed up against something dangerous without ever leaving the safety of daylight. But beneath that stage show, there's another layer of truth, one that never sold a t-shirt in its life. It's in the way some people still cross themselves and whisper something extra when they pass Congo Square. It's in the way a few shopkeepers still sprinkle brick dust you can't see across their doors. It's in the fact that, every now and then, someone swears they see a tall shadow in an alley that seems to bend too sharply when it turns, like it's listening for a drum beat nobody else hears. You can call it superstition if it makes you feel better. You can chalk it up to the imagination of a city that loves drama. You can say it's just stories, but remember this before you shrug it all off. Nobody, not one breathing soul, has ever been able to explain how those early bodies were positioned with such exact symmetry around Congo Square, each one marking a point on a veve only someone trained in the old ways would recognize. No one has ever offered a satisfying reason why the killings stopped so suddenly after that night by the levee. No trial, no confession shouted on the front page, just silence and a quick, tidy line about a dead perpetrator. And no one has ever accounted for what some of the old-timers swore they saw the next week when they passed Detective Boot walking alone down Rampart Street. One woman said his shadow stretched a little too long behind him for the time of day. Another insisted she heard him humming under his breath in a language that never came from any church choir. A third claimed she spotted him pausing at a crossroads, eyes closed, like he was listening for approval from something she sure as hell didn't want to see. Maybe they were mistaken. Maybe grief and fear made them see things that weren't there. Or maybe, and this is the part the city would rather not dwell on, when Léon Boot stepped into that warehouse to break another man's ritual, he came out with a mark of his own, a kind of invisible scar that bound him quietly to the war of spirits he helped interrupt. Because wars like that don't end. They pause, they go quiet, they change shape. They wait for the next person who steps too close to certain doors, too curious or too stubborn to leave them shut. So when you hear folks talk about the voodoo murders of the 1920s, when you hear some true crime tour guide toss out phrases like gris-gris sewn into flesh and symbols painted in blood, you'll know it wasn't just a campfire story invented for tips. There were real bodies. There were real files. There were real people who woke up every day of that long summer wondering if they'd be next, or if they'd find somebody they loved laid out under a hand-drawn sign they didn't understand. And somewhere in a quiet corner of this city, in a house that might already be dust, there once sat a shoebox under a floorboard with a notebook inside. In that notebook were pages of veves and one countermark drawn in shaky lantern light by a man who'd seen too much. At the bottom of the page, in careful handwriting, were 3 words, meant as both warning and prayer. Do not repeat. This is Beau LeClair, bringing you another piece of the South that never made it into the tourists' brochures. If you ever find yourself in the French Quarter after midnight, and the wind hits just right, and the lamps seem to flicker for no good reason, remember that some wars don't need guns to leave scars. Some of them start with a symbol, a whisper, and a body laid out under a sky that remembers more than it lets on.